You're standing in darkness. Stone walls press close. Somewhere, water drips with the regularity of a heartbeat. The air tastes of iron and something older, something wrong. Your eyes adjust slowly, and you realize the stains on the floor aren't rust. They're the residue of 3 generations of screams absorbed into stone that remembers everything. The year is 1478. The city is Milan, and in this moment, you are about to witness what happens when human ingenuity turns entirely toward the science of suffering. A man hangs suspended before you. His name is Giovanni Borromeo. His wrists are bound behind his back, arms wrenched upward by a rope that disappears into the ceiling's shadows. He has been hanging for 6 hours. His shoulders dislocated within the first 20 minutes. That was the merciful part. What comes next will take 3 days. Giovanni is a clerk, his alleged crime: stealing 12 florins from the ducal treasury. For this, he will confess to murders he never committed, betray friends who are innocent, and beg for a death that will arrive only when his body has nothing left to break. The man approaching with the instruments is named Abramo. He inherited this profession from his father, who inherited it from his grandfather. Abramo has done this 437 times. He knows the precise pressure required to fracture a rib without puncturing a lung. He knows the exact angle to dislocate a joint while preserving the surrounding ligaments. He knows the moment measured not in minutes but in heartbeats, when a human mind shatters completely and the person becomes simply meat that screams. And he knows Giovanni has many hours left before reaching that moment. Before we descend further into this darkness together, I have to say it still amazes me that a story this brutal, from a world this distant, somehow reaches you wherever you are right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. These voices from the past deserve to be heard everywhere. What Abramo cannot know, standing in his stone chamber in 1478, is that archaeologists will find this place 5 centuries later. They will discover instruments so sophisticated in their cruelty that modern engineers will struggle to reverse engineer their full function. They will find bones-bearing marks that tell stories of suffering so systematic that forensic specialists will require psychological counseling after completing their analysis. They will find records meticulous, detailed records documenting every session with the precision of a medical journal, revealing that medieval torturers understood human anatomy and pain psychology with terrifying accuracy. The medieval period was not an age of random savagery. It was an age of industrialized suffering, an era when causing maximum agony while maintaining maximum consciousness was considered a professional skill worthy of guild membership and family dynasties. When the study of pain was pursued with the same scholarly dedication that others brought to theology or astronomy, here's what you need to understand before we continue. Everything you think you know about medieval torture is wrong. Not because the reality was less brutal than popular culture suggests, because it was worse. Systematically, scientifically, incomprehensibly worse. The devices you've seen in museums, the Iron Maidens, the racks, the thumbscrews, those were the common tools. The everyday instruments used for routine interrogation, what we're about to explore, goes far beyond those familiar horrors, into territory that medieval authorities themselves considered so extreme they often destroyed the records to prevent public knowledge. The first method most people have never heard of was so psychologically devastating that victims often went permanently insane before any physical damage occurred. You know about sleep deprivation. Modern interrogators use it. Human rights organizations condemn it. But what medieval torturers discovered about sleeplessness went far beyond anything practiced today. The vigil was developed in Spanish monasteries during the 13th century. Originally as a religious practice for monks seeking divine visions through extreme wakefulness, when the Inquisition formed in 1231, they recognized its potential immediately. Spiritual discipline became systematic psychological destruction. Isabella de Córdoba became one of the first documented victims in 1247. She was accused of practicing Jewish rituals in secret, a capital offense in medieval Spain. The inquisitors wanted names. They wanted her entire network exposed. Isabella refused to confess because she was genuinely Catholic and had committed no crime. For the first 3 days, guards simply prevented her from sleeping by prodding her with sticks whenever her eyes closed. Crude, but effective. By day 4, Isabella was hallucinating seeing demons in the corners of her cell, hearing voices commanding her to confess. By day 7, she no longer recognized her own children when they were brought to visit. By day 9, she confessed to crimes that were physically impossible, describing rituals that no actual Jewish practice included, naming people who didn't exist, providing elaborate fantasies that her shattered mind generated to make the sleeplessness stop. But here's what made the vigil truly horrific. The inquisitors didn't accept her confession. A confession obtained under torture was considered legally unreliable. So they let Isabella sleep for 2 days, waited for her mind to partially recover, then asked her to confirm her confession voluntarily. When she recanted explaining that she'd invented everything to end the torment, they began the vigil again. This cycle repeated for 11 weeks. Sleep deprivation until psychosis, brief recovery, request for confirmation, recantation, more sleep deprivation. By the end, Isabella existed in a state that modern psychiatrists would recognize as permanent dissociative disorder. She confirmed her confession not because she was tortured into it, but because she genuinely no longer knew what was real. She had confessed so many times that the false memories had overwritten her actual memories. She believed she was guilty because her mind could no longer access the truth. The vigil was eventually refined with sensory elements that accelerated breakdown. Victims were placed in cells with constant dripping water, irregular loud noises, flickering lights. The unpredictability prevented adaptation. The body couldn't adjust to a pattern because there was no pattern. Modern research has confirmed that unpredictable stress causes more psychological damage than predictable stress of greater intensity. Medieval torturers discovered this through experimentation 5 centuries before psychology existed as a discipline. Records from the Toledo Inquisition show the vigil had an 89% confession rate, compared to 63% for physical torture alone. More importantly, vigil confessions were considered more legally valid because victims appeared to confess voluntarily after their recovery period. Isabella de Córdoba was burned at the stake in 1248 after confirming her confession. Her children were taken by the church, her property was seized, and her case became a template applied to thousands of other victims over the following 3 centuries. But the vigil was considered gentle. What comes next was reserved for cases requiring more aggressive interrogation. The instrument looked almost elegant polished metal, shaped like a pear, small enough to fit in a torturer's palm. With a screw mechanism at the base that caused 4 segments to separate when turned, museums display these objects with clinical descriptions that fail to convey their actual purpose. The pear of anguish was inserted into body cavities. For men accused of homosexuality, it was rectal. For women accused of sexual crimes, it was vaginal. For those accused of heresy or blasphemy, it was oral. Once inserted, The torturer would slowly turn the screw, expanding the segments millimeter by millimeter until tissue tore. A court record from Lyon dated 1326 describes the interrogation of a woman named Marguerite, accused of adultery. The document is clinical in its detail, recording that the pair was expanded over 4 hours, with expansion halted whenever Marguerite lost consciousness and resumed once she was revived. The stated purpose was extracting names of other adulterous women in the city. The actual purpose, evident from the document's gleeful tone, was punishment through suffering that would leave permanent damage. What makes this instrument particularly horrifying is its precision. The expansion was controlled through gear mechanisms that allowed adjustments of fractions of millimeters. Torturers could maintain a victim at the edge of tissue failure for extended periods, maximizing pain while preventing the merciful release of severe injury. Some variants included spikes on the expanding segments that would embed in flesh, making any movement cause additional damage. Modern gynecologists who have examined surviving pairs note that the design exploits anatomical knowledge supposedly beyond medieval medical understanding. The instruments were engineered to apply pressure to nerve clusters while avoiding major blood vessels that would cause rapid death. This wasn't random cruelty. This was cruelty designed with anatomical expertise. The pair existed in multiple sizes for different applications. Oral pairs were larger, with blunted edges designed to dislocate the jaw when fully expanded. Smaller variants were created for what records euphemistically call application to extremities: fingers, toes, ears, and other body parts with concentrated nerve endings. A craftsman in Venice named Lorenzo Bardi became famous for producing custom pairs commissioned by nobility, who wanted instruments suited to specific purposes. His workshop records, discovered in 1973, show orders specifying dimensions, expansion ratios, and surface textures. Some clients requested religious imagery engraved on the segments, so that victims would see saints and angels as the instrument destroyed them from within. The psychological element was considered as important as the physical damage. What you need to understand is that the pair wasn't exceptional. It was standard equipment in most European judicial torture chambers by the 14th century. The next method was reserved for crimes considered even more serious. Imagine a wooden pyramid roughly 3 feet tall, mounted on a sturdy frame with ropes and pulleys attached to the ceiling above it. Now imagine being stripped naked, suspended by harnesses around your arms and legs, and slowly lowered onto the pyramid's point. The Judas cradle worked through body weight. Victims were lowered until the pyramid's apex pressed against their most sensitive areas, then left to hang with just enough support that their full weight wasn't immediately applied. Over hours, exhaustion would cause their muscles to fail, lowering them further onto the point. The torture was essentially self-inflicted. The body's inability to maintain suspension caused progressive impalement. A Florentine banker named Aldo Grimaldi experienced the Judas cradle in 1411 after being accused of financial crimes against the Medici family. Court records show he was suspended for 9 hours on the first day, 8 hours on the second, and 11 hours on the third, before confessing to embezzlement he may or may not have actually committed. The confession became irrelevant when he died of infection 16 days later, his internal injuries having become septic despite physicians' attempts at treatment. The genius of the Judas cradle, if such a word can be applied to something so monstrously as its efficiency. Unlike methods requiring constant attention from torturers, the cradle worked automatically. A single guard could monitor multiple victims simultaneously, only intervening to raise them slightly when unconsciousness threatened to end the session prematurely. The device was also valued for leaving no visible external injuries. Victims could be displayed publicly after interrogation without obvious signs of torture, maintaining the legal fiction that confessions were voluntary. Internal damage was invisible to observers. This made the Judas cradle particularly popular for extracting confessions from nobility or clergy whose torture needed to be deniable. What the archaeological record shows is that many victims of the Judas cradle never stood trial. The injuries were often fatal, regardless of what they confessed or how quickly they confessed it. The device wasn't really about extracting information. It was about demonstrating what authority could do to those who challenged it. The confession was almost incidental to the real purpose, the suffering itself. But compared to what comes next, the Judas cradle was almost merciful in its relative speed. This section will be difficult. What I'm about to describe was used almost exclusively on women, and its purpose went beyond interrogation into pure punishment designed to destroy femininity itself. The breast ripper was exactly what its name suggests. Siren claws, often heated until glowing, attached to handles that allowed torturers to grip and tear breast tissue. The device was used on women accused of adultery, self-induced abortion, heresy, witchcraft, and in some cases simply for being unmarried past a certain age. A woman named Agnes Bernauer was subjected to the breast ripper in Bavaria in 1435. Her crime was marrying above her station. She was a commoner who had secretly married Duke Albrecht III. When the Duke's father discovered the marriage, he had Agnes arrested on fabricated charges of witchcraft. The torture served no interrogation purpose. There was nothing to confess. The breast ripper was pure punishment for the crime of being a woman who had risen above her assigned place. Agnes survived the initial torture, but was then drowned in the Danube. Her mutilated body displayed as a warning to other women who might imagine themselves worthy of nobility. Her story became legend in Bavaria, though the legend typically romanticizes the drowning while omitting the torture that preceded it. The breast ripper existed in two main variants. The spider was a fixed-position device mounted on walls where women were pressed against the claws. The less sophisticated version was handheld, allowing torturers to attack from multiple angles. Both versions were often heated before use, combining tearing with burning. What made this device particularly cruel was that it targeted anatomy associated with nurturing and femininity. The destruction was symbolic as much as physical. Women who survived Gruesome did bore scars that marked them permanently as fallen, as punished, as objects of public shame. In an era when women's value was tied to marriage and motherhood, the breast ripper destroyed both possibilities while leaving victims alive to experience the social consequences. Church records from the witch trial period showed the breast ripper was used during interrogation to encourage confessions, but it was also prescribed as punishment after conviction. A woman could be found guilty of witchcraft, sentenced to burning, and also sentenced to the breast ripper before execution as additional punishment for particularly severe crimes like allegedly causing crop failures or childhood deaths. The gender specificity of this torture reveals something important about medieval justice. Torture wasn't applied equally. Women faced instruments designed specifically to attack their bodies in ways men didn't. The breast ripper had no male equivalent because the torture wasn't just about it was about destroying womanhood, specifically about punishing female bodies for being female bodies that had somehow transgressed. If you've heard of medieval torture, you've probably heard of breaking on the wheel. But the reality of this punishment was far more systematic and prolonged than popular depictions suggest. The condemned was stripped and spread across a large wooden wheel with arms and legs extended along the spokes. The executioner then used a heavy iron hammer to systematically break every major bone in the body. The sequence was precise, following written protocols that varied by region. In the German territories, the standard sequence was ankles first, then shins, then knees, then thighs, then pelvis, then forearms, then upper arms, then hands. Each bone was struck multiple times with carefully measured force designed to fracture without severing. The entire process took between 45 minutes and 2 hours, depending on the executioner's skill and the desired level of suffering. A man named Peter Stump was broken on the wheel. In Betburg, Germany in 1589, his crime was supposedly being a werewolf, but his actual crime was probably being an unpopular outsider during a period of hysteria. The court record describes his execution with disturbing precision. First, his skin was torn with red-hot pincers in 10 separate places. Then his limbs were broken on the wheel. Then his arms and legs were removed with an axe. Only then was he beheaded, and finally his body was burned. The entire execution took approximately 3 hours. Stump was conscious for most of it. The wheel was specifically designed to inflict maximum damage while avoiding rapid death. Breaking bones is agonizing, but it rarely causes immediate death unless major blood vessels are severed. The protocol avoided the heart, the neck, and the major arteries precisely so that victims would remain alive and aware throughout. But breaking was only the first part. After the bones were shattered, the body was woven through the wheels, spokes, threading ruined limbs between the wooden bars to create a display. The wheel was then mounted on a tall pole and left in public view. Some victims died within hours from shock or blood loss. Others survived for days, exposed to the elements, their broken bodies unable to move, while birds began feeding on them while they still lived. A French court record from Toulouse documents a man who survived on the wheel for 9 days before finally dying. Each day, a priest visited to offer him the opportunity to confess additional sins. Each day he was technically alive, though beyond any possibility of recovery. The wheel was public entertainment. Crowds gathered to watch executions, and the display afterwards served as ongoing warning. Children grew up seeing broken bodies mounted on wheels at city entrances. The sight became so normalized that medieval art often includes wheel displays in background scenes of everyday life, casual evidence of state power's ultimate expression. What we know from medical analysis of skeletal remains is that the wheel was remarkably effective at causing suffering without causing death. Bones healed incorrectly if victims survived long enough, creating twisted masses of calcified tissue that would have been agonizing even during recovery. The next method worked on similar principles, but applied them internally. This technique required no specialized equipment: a bucket, a rat, fire, and time. The victim was restrained on their back, unable to move. A metal bucket or cage was placed on their abdomen, open side down, with a rat trapped inside. Fire was then applied to the outside of the container, heating the metal and the air within. The rat, desperate to escape the heat, would dig downward through the only soft surface available: human flesh.